Today's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you by StarCityGames.com, where our sale this week gives you 10% off all sealed products. That's booster boxes, challenger decks, commander decks, and so much more, all this week until Sunday the 30th of January at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time at StarCityGames.com/sale. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 41 of Dominaria's Judgment, a weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I'm Dom Harvey, I'm here with Ari Lax, and today I guess we have a non-announcement to get to, and then also an announcement to get to as well.
Yeah, well, the non-announcement is really the topic of our episode, because it was really interesting to watch in the days leading up to the ban announcement that hit a bunch of cards, including Divide by Zero and other formats. It felt like there were a number of buzz trains started about bans in Modern, because obviously the announcement of the ban. Okay, so there was the Pauper announcement that announced that there would be another announcement occurring in a arbitrary number of formats, and that got people churning on stuff. And I think the discussion is very interesting, because I think that I think we've alluded to this over time, but there's a lot of cards in Modern right now that are the kind of things that make people really opinionated and I don't want to say they solely lead to bad play experiences, but can lead to negative play experiences and are understandably things that people might want to discuss banning. So we discussed the entire ban list as unbans, but it's kind of maybe worth talking about it the other way. And that's where we're going this week.
Yeah, I think I next leveled myself with the prediction metagaming for this ban announcement, because when they said there will be an announcement affecting multiple formats, part of me thought, well, you would just specify what those formats are to stop people from losing their minds for the next however long, unless it was a change which affected multiple formats at the same time, but not in a specific way. And to me, that pointed clearly at some change to companions. And so I really let myself believe this and buy into it for most of this week. And then instead we got a very, I guess, obvious and conservative ban and legacy, a pretty sweeping change to standard. Not that anyone really cares about that, but I guess that's kind of the point, right? You got to try and reinvigorate that somehow. And then God only knows what is going on with Historic, or Alchemy, rather. That's if there was an Alchemy podcast out there, I'm not even sure there is one yet. I'm sure they will have a fun time digesting all of that.
Did you actually know that a Acererak had a sacrifice ability on it that got deleted from the card?
No.
Okay,
I knew that it went. Okay, I know it goes infinite with Alluran, and that's my total extent of knowledge about that card. And I assume that's still the case, because if it's not, I will be very depressed.
So it does. So there is a line of text. I'm not going to go any further. I'm going to let the listeners stop and think if they know what it is. But there is a line of text on Acererak that was removed that is, your opponent may sacrifice a creature. And that is what was removed. I have resolved this card and had it on the battlefield and not like bouncing multiple times. I had no idea that was on the card. And that is one of the things that was deleted. Anyways, that's enough about that format.
Well, see, the thing is here, I think I don't know if this counts as you posting an L or something, but the idea that you have played enough of that draft format to have resolved this card several times speaks volumes in and of itself, because that card is not showing up in any reasonable application in any constructed format. And I guess that's part of the impetus behind this wave of changes is we want cards with the word dungeon on them to actually appear in decks and not just clutter up Magic Online drop-down menus for the rest of time. But I don't know if even after boosting, what was it, like a dozen cards at once that reference dungeons in some way, I'm not sure that any of that is actually any closer to reality now.
I think my understanding, just chatting some people, I'm guessing what the philosophy is they probably went through the top 50 to 100 cards played on the ladder in general and looked at the ones that were disproportionately overplayed relative to their win rate and tried to see which of those they could buff so that people playing with the cards they want to play with, that like, if people are playing the cards they want to play and losing a ton, it would be better if they lost a little bit instead.
Yeah, I think this was the motivation behind buffing Cosmos Elixir the last time, where I think they explicitly said, people love crafting this card, but people are not winning with this card. And maybe that's okay, as long as they're having fun losing. But if the card is a little bit better, they might be having a little bit more fun in the process. And I guess there are a lot of quiet fans of Dungeons out there who, will love to see everything that happened today. So that's the non-announcement. There is, of course, an announcement in housekeeping terms we have to get to. And that is that if you've been following, I guess, Twitter today, or you've made your daily visit to StarCityGames.com, you would have seen that the written content there and the other content is going through a pretty radical restructuring at the moment. As a result of that, this show won't be sponsored by Star City Games after all of that wraps up at the end of February, and unclear what the future is in general for the show at this point. But you will know more on that than we do, or when we do, rather. We're kind of unclear ourselves at the moment.
Yeah, very possible more than we do right now, because this episode posts tomorrow, and we're talking about this today. So time is linear and things occur. But, Yeah,
this is effectively an announcement of an announcement. So we're really taking a page out of Botsy's book there. But for now, the show must go on. And as always, we will kick off the show by going over the weekend results here. So we had the usual challenges, except the Saturday Modern Challenge, as is always the case at this time of the season, was replaced by the Showcase Challenge. So once again, this is the feeder tournament, if you like, that qualifies the top 8 here for the playoff, and then the winner of that in a few months' time will book their seat in the Magic Online Championship Series, which is one of the few remaining forms of high-level competitive Magic left at this point.
Yeah, it is actually like a really awesome and exciting event. I actually really like the structure where, if you have not caught this event, they have 8 players, and they play an 8-player pod of Modern and an 8-player pod of Cube Draft. The winners of those face off in the finals for who's the winner. If the same person wins both, they just win the whole thing. That has not happened yet,
which
though.
I love. Yeah. No one has pulled off the clean 6-0 yet, but we live in hope. And we have the next one upcoming, I think in just a few weeks, sometime the middle of February, and whoever wins the showcase that this thing just qualified for, I think that will be coming up in May or June, around that time. So a lot to look forward to on that front. And the winner here, Marcus MPV on Amulet Titan, a deck which has really had a roller coaster of a ride through the last 6 or 7 months with Modern Horizons 2. But for now, and no guarantees about the future, but for this one very specific tournament on this specific weekend, Amulet came out on top, and I'm clinging to that as a consolation in these difficult times.
Yeah, I think that this deck is pretty well positioned if the metagame shifts toward, if the joke is that Hammer has been pushed out of the top of the metagame, and that the 4-color versus Shadow matchup is slowly turning towards the 4-color deck, I like Amulet as just like a broader scope version of all the other linear exploits to the 4-color deck. I think there are some questions you have to answer involving like your speed against the speed of the landless decks that I don't quite have the data on, as well as like questions like, why is there a tireless tracker in this deck list? I don't have a great question, but I'm just glad to see tireless tracker hanging around in 2022. But
that has been my question. Yeah, that has been my question whenever I have seen tireless tracker in a Modern deck list for, 5 years and counting now. I just don't think the card is really that impressive on rate in Modern, and certainly in the context we have right now, where the slower fair decks that it's meant to be good against can just go over the top of it so easily, or just remove it so easily, and they don't have much of a trouble doing either. I think you do touch on something important about, we had this uneasy equilibrium of Hammer over here, and then 4-color and Shadow, and if one of those got squeezed out, which I think definitively is what happened to Hammer over the past few weeks, and that's borne out in these results as well, then that really opens a door for a lot of other decks to come up and compete for space there. And if your deck is in that tier itself and lines up well against some of the other decks in that tier, then maybe it's a smart choice. I think that's kind of a mixed bag for Amulet, honestly. So Belcher is the traditional Nightmare matchup. It's a faster combo deck on average that usually has a bunch of Blood Moons and Force of Vigors in its 75. It is really hard to draw up a worse matchup than that. That being said, some of the other decks in that space, we mentioned the kind of graveyard creature decks that have popped up. We have a copy of Dredge in one of these results. We had the Crabvine deck that Cave Dan came oh so close with last week. And Amulet traditionally has feasted upon those decks. And so, you love to see that if those decks are picking up. And then all the stuff in between, like Burn, for example, very good against the current iterations of Shadow, and also very good against 4-color if the 4-color decks aren't taking that matchup seriously. And once again, that has always been the matchup you most want to see as Amulet Titan. So I think there are definite pros and cons here, but this may have been like a subtly smart metagame call for the weekend.
Yep. Moving on to talking about those 4-color decks, does that 4-color matchup still hold against the Indomitable Creativity decks? We see Spider Space in second place with what it seems is like rapidly becoming I don't know if it's like the flavor of the week build or stock, but this is the Archon of Cruelty Indomitable Creativity deck that it's just all the cards you saw in the Creativity deck before, Hard Evidence, Prismari Command, Dwarven Mine. You're just flipping Archons because Archon is really good versus everything. Is this deck, my experience with it is that it's noticeably better than the other 4-color decks against Hammer, just because of like you're starting on Prismari Command and the combo kill makes it like they just don't have the tread to like pick up Aluris and keep going. So it felt better there, but how do you feel about this against the combo decks? But then also like you're very clearly sacrificing ground against Shadow, right?
Definitely. And I think that's not a sacrifice you can really afford to make at the moment, given that Hammer is on the decline and Shadow is everywhere. You would much rather be the traditional 4-color deck, which still boasts a pretty good matchup against Hammer and is much better configured to beat up on Shadow. That being said, we actually saw 2 different flavors of creativity do well in this tournament. We had Spider Space in second place with the full 5 colors of creativity, a light touch of black for, I guess, hardcasting Archon as a stretch goal, but also for Thoughtseize in the sideboard here. And so that very tenuous mana base that was held together by, Wicker Tape and Ren and Six now has to do even more heavy lifting. And then you go down to 18th place, I think it is. We have Mason Clark on a different variation of this deck, which has been picking up steam recently. And this is just, is it creativity? And doubling down on the main plan here with Transmogrify to unearth Archon of Cruelty here. And beyond that, it's just the kind of things you would expect to see. It's Fire Ice and Lightning Bolt and Spreading Seas, a card which you don't really have room for in the conventional 4-color deck, at least in the main deck, for creativity. But in here, this is just another really nice, cantrip that's also this Stone Rain that draws you a card in some situations. Just a great card in general. And we've seen the 4-color decks use it to a lot of success. And this deck feels very much like a combo control deck in the traditional vein of I'm going to do a lot of annoying things in the first few turns and then suddenly turn the corner in an instant and make a very undercosted Archon of Cruelty.
Yeah, I think the big split between these is whether you think Teferi Time Raveler is a good card in the current metagame. Ren and Six, there's some value in just hitting your land drops with Ren and Six, but I think that almost as much of the value is like once you start stretching this mana base to be like Dwarven Mine and Friends, like you really need to Ren and Six back all your fetch lands to hit your giant color spread. It's like the classic splashing for your mana fixing kind of thing. Yes. But I think Teferi is the card that's like making the big difference, it feels like.
Yeah, and given the demands on the mana base, because you have the triomes and the fetch lands subsidizing the shock lands, it feels like once you start adding colors, there's not that much of a difference between the third and the fourth and even the fifth. And so that's why, the 5-color list from Spider Space, I don't know if the mana there is actually that much worse than it is in the stock 4-color list, but I think there is a pretty sizable gap between those lists over there and then this list here, which gets to run the basic island and feel good about it, for example. Or you can just fetch Steam Vents in the dark, fetch Dwarfen Mine without worrying about drawing this card in 2 of your secondary colors that you now have no hope of realistically casting anymore.
Yeah, and I guess we have been talking bad about the Shadow matchup here, but Spider Space in the top 4 did 2-0 against one of the 2 Shadow players who were also in the top 4, just both on like super stock lists. It's just, I think the only difference that I can see skimming between these two is one has 2 lightning bolts and the other has a bolt in the push. But I mean, a single match doesn't mean a lot, but I don't think I'm wrong to assess it that way, but there are like the deck with Remand has to be bad against the deck with Death Shadow. But I think that there are lineups that can win because you just have so much power, and Archon specifically is noticeably better than Emrakul or Emissary against them just because of the value it provides.
That is one of the places that these two decks intersect, is their choice of Archon over the very old school like Velomachus setups, or the more traditional Serra's Emissary plus Emrakul, or even just double Serra's Emissary in some cases. I'm not convinced that Archon is actually that much better on average against a deck like Shadow, where if you just flop Emrakul into play, most of the time, I think that's going to be good enough. Unless they can kill you immediately, you will get an attack in, and that attack will be lethal. And you even manage to get around stuff like if you're forced to block a Death Shadow in fear of Dress Down, then your 15-15 is still bigger than their 13-13, for example. Whereas I think there will be a decent number of games where you manage to get exactly one Archon into play, and that's great, but then one Unholy Heat just collapses the whole house of cards.
I have higher expectations of the immediate, like, giant card swing on Archon, and I think that you do gain against Dress Down with Archon, whereas, like, with Emrakul, it's easier for them to, like, Dress Down on your turn so that Emrakul is just a 15-15 and then doesn't have good attacks and they can, like, repressure maybe. Whereas with Archon, like, if they Dress Down the Archon, like, in response to the creativity, you still have an Archon that they have to kill, and I might be wrong in that. Like, if they don't have the Dress Down up, like, it forced them to have it right then, because if it triggers, I don't really see that as a generally recoverable situation. But this may be over speculating on the role of Dress Down in the mirror in this specific matchup.
I do think as well that Teferi is more important when it's trying to protect either Serra's Emissary or Emrakul, where with Archon, if it gets removed, you've still gained a decent amount from that exchange, whereas if you shove your chips on a creativity and you hit Emrakul, if they have their own Teferi, let's say, or Solitude against the 4-color decks, or some way to interact with it, you get nothing back from that exchange. And so being able to set that up in a protected way at instant speed, I think is very important. Whereas with Archon, especially if you're able to creativity for 2, sometimes you get 2 Archons and both of them are dealt with, and you're able to just stitch together a win with Dwarven Mind tokens or whatever anyway, because the hard work has been done at that point.
Yeah, resolving, like, that is the actual Cruel Ultimatum, is resolving 2 Archon triggers, and I don't really think that is something your opponents usually beat.
As you said, 3rd and 4th place, just copies of stocked Grixis Death Shadow. Nothing really new there. No big shake-up in the format. This deck is very good, kind of fundamentally unassailable in a lot of ways, and until there are changes to Modern, potentially changes to the Modern ban list, I expect this to be, a big player going forward.
Yep. I think the scarier thing is the 5th place player, not necessarily the deck, but Discover N. The winning, if I looked at the vintage spreadsheets correctly, I believe Discover N is the winningest vintage player across the last year, just killing everyone with Doomsday over and over. And here they are in this top 8 in 5th place with 4-color good stuff, opting for 1 Eladamri's Call, Wandering Mind, Eternal Witness, like a little more. I want to call this like an Eternal Savvy kind of thing, where you're like min-maxing your bad draw slots in favor of some flexibility, which I tend to like. But other players, I don't think necessarily agree and tend to have more Witness. And then just also having 2 Time Warp. Probably because the Ren and 6 kill with Time Warp is actually threatening.
Yeah, I do love the split of 1 Eternal Witness, 1 Wandering Mind, 1 Eladamri's Call. So you can just dig up whatever you need in that specific situation. Some other fun of one-offs littered throughout this 95. We have a Fiery Justice in the sideboard. So I would say this is definitively a boomer card, but one which, as a boomer, you have some experience with. So tell the folks at home what this one does.
So this is green, white, red. Deal 5 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets, and your opponent gains 5 life. hold on a second. I got to double check the text on this. Any number of targets. Okay, the printed version that showed up on the auto card said creatures or players, but it was printed like just before the Planeswalker rule change, I think. I think the notable part here... that was...
You registered this card in a Pro Tour. I had faith in you to deliver the goods here.
Well, I think that the problem here is that Fury exists, and that has eaten up most of Fiery Justice's place in the format. However, Discover N is just playing 4 Fury, so there are times where you want 5 Fury, and a 5th Fury is still a really good Fury.
Yeah, I think the way this card hooks you in is, okay, they're going to have like a Ragavan and a Dragon's Rage Channeler and a Death Shadow, and I'm going to kill the red creatures and just get the Death Shadow there on the house. I don't know how often that actually plays out in practice, but yeah, if you feel like you really need that 5th Fury, and if you think that, I guess, small creature decks of some description are going to make a comeback, then this is a nice way to hedge against all of that. The really interesting thing about this list to me is if you look through the Goldfish page for Discover N, it is, as you say, a lot of truly absurd results with Vintage Doomsday, but then also some results, feeding their way into Modern with 4-color Blink. And their earlier lists of that deck had Ragavan, which is the big development from this weekend, which maybe should have been obvious in retrospect, but maybe Discover N was just ahead of the curve. And then now, at the moment where this is the talk of the town and everyone is jumping on this new development, Discover N is, I guess, kicking it old school with just 4 Fury, 4 Ephemerate, really leaning hard on that angle instead. So I don't know if this is a throwback or if this is so next level that now it's wrapping around and everything that's old is new again, or what's going on here?
I think that Ragavan is very specifically good in this deck against in the control mirrors, having the earlier threat like that is always great. And it's also a card that can buy you outs against the more linear decks where your interaction might not line up flawlessly. Most notably, we'll get to this soon, but the interaction of Ragavan against Oops All Spells is a delight. Just sometimes it happens. I think that I would not want to be a Ragavan deck in weeks past. Like, if all of my opponents are going to be Shadow and Hammer, I don't want Ragavans in my 4-color deck. Like, they should not be anywhere near that. Putting a Ragavan on the battlefield early against the Shadow deck just like invites the kind of exchanges they want to fight against your deck. Instead of you accumulating resources and making big plays, you're just like getting into the chip shot battles on low mana. That's just not going to work out. And then Ragavan has like a long history of being just actively bad against Hammer. So I think that the pickup in Ragavans on the Sunday challenge that we'll get to, I think that may have to do in part with the Hammer reduction there.
Yeah, and I think the increase in these various linear decks, which are hard to prepare for at the same time, right? The cards that you want against Burn or Belcher or Oops All Spells, where it's in theory in the same space as Belcher, but plays out quite differently. And then you've got a copy of Mill in the top 8 as well. This event was won by Amulet Titan. When you can't really prepare for everything at once, and there's a lot of pressure to just get the game over with, having this threat like Ragavan, which snowballs so quickly and where you actually do have a lot of ways to force it through, because that was the issue with Ragavan in just random decks in the past, is if you weren't willing and able to back it up and use removal spells, trade off with blockers, protect it from interaction, then your Ragavan wouldn't do anything in the short term, and then in the mid game you would just draw a dead Ragavan when you needed basically anything else. These 4-color decks, though, especially the ones that have more Lightning Bolts, more Furies, and so on, you can actually protect the Queen, if you like, with your Ragavan, and that is a viable plan. Not a great one, but it's at least a plan against a deck like Belcher, instead of just dying with a 7-card hand full of removal spells.
Yeah, I also like how this deck has the nice interaction of, like, you have all these colors, so your Ragavan's natural hits are a little better. Like, you don't need quite as many treasure tokens sometimes. I know some of the other Ragavan decks can get into trouble of like, oh, I have like the Rakdos one like flips it to fairy, and it's like, oh, I needed my treasures earlier. So this is just like, yeah, I'll just cast whatever. It'll be fine. I'll just get value in whatever way I can. So that is one nice aspect of Ragavan in the 4-color decks.
Yeah, between abundant growth and just being 4 colors anyway, which necessitates abundant growth, you can just cast whatever you hit, even if it's like a double pip card where one treasure isn't going to get you there. And on top of that, having acceleration in these decks is pretty nice, where if Ragavan is setting up turn 3 Omnath or turn 4 Omnath into fetch land into 5 mana for whatever, then that's a really tough sequence to come back from. And you can try and set that up in other ways. So the very early list of this deck had Utopia Sprawl. Growth Spiral was there back in the Uro Field of the Dead days. But all of those have their own weaknesses. If you think Ragavan is just a good card in the deck on the whole, well, this is a really nice subset of nut draws that opens up to you now.
Yeah, it almost feels like a Deathrite Shaman-esque effect in that context. I mean, this is another topic we'll get to, but this is probably the closest I think it's been to being Deathrite Shaman.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a pretty varied mix just outside this top 8 here. So in 8th and 9th, we have 2 quite different lists of Is It Murktide, Bernas Torres and O Danielakos. And also... Is it 8th, 9th? Okay. O Danielakos and Burn Taco 77. There we go. One of them has, Archmage's Charm, 4 copies, 2 main deck Spell Pierces to back those up. And then the other list has main deck Blood Moons and a Fury, which is a card we've seen popping into these main decks here. So even though this is straddling that top 8 threshold, if tiebreakers go differently and this deck puts 2 copies in the top 8, that's a talking point in a way that, 1 copy of the top 8 can be written off. So always good to look outside into top 16, top 32 to get a more broad picture of what's going on there. And then we have the Brawlback Showdown of the Skulls deck, always a fan favorite here in 11th place. I'd love to see that one popping up. We have Mono Green Tron in 12th in the hands of Duan Seio, the same Tron player who finished in the top 8 of the Super PTQ that was held last week. So worth keeping track of them. And then just, some of the decks you associate with specific players. So Riznia, longtime listeners will remember them as the Azorius Mill player who has put up some good results, and they're in this top 16 as well. So again, it's this kind of pleasing mix of more of the same, but then also if you know one of these other decks really well, then you have a good shot at it too.
Yeah, Mill did put a player in the top 8, which is nice. This is the more traditional Dimir with actually a Trap Maker's Snare. That's been like a pretty cool one-of to layer the archive traps that people have picked up on. And I guess is now a good time to wrap around to the is Oops All Spells like actually good or just the new hotness discussion, since that rounds out the top 8?
Yeah, let's get into that. What is your take on that? 'Cause this is a deck which has been around in some form since Zendikar Rising, but mostly as this short-term exploit to larger metagame trends. It's never been a deck where on any given weekend you can expect to face this deck several times and you expect to pencil in a copy for the top 8 of any tournament.
Well, I think the Memories Journey Thassa's Oracle Jack-O-Lantern setup is actually like a very significant addition. It really changes the structure of what kind of hate you need to beat the deck, just because they have like, if you Nihil Spellbomb them, it is converting an immediate loss into a slow loss, which is not enough for a lot of decks. The other thing I think that has changed is, this was a discussion I had with actually Alex Magelton in the last week or so. He was vaguely interested in Hammer because of his long history playing Affinity, even though his completely and utterly shredded by shuffling Mox Opals are stuck in a box in the closet forever. And he brought up this point of Stony Silence because of years of trauma brought about by opponents casting it and having to sit there and lose to it. And I think that we came to the conclusion that the card's just like not very good in Modern. And like, yeah, there was that Affinity deck that won the challenge last week, and that deck is bad against Stony Silence. And yeah, like, it doesn't have to be Stony Silence. It can be Collector Oof. It can be Karn. There's just not a ton of those cards these days. And I think that the like free roll KOing of the artifact mana was actually one of the big ways to free roll hamper the Oops All Spells decks, as well as the presence of like Ghost Quarter and Field of the Dead, or not Field of the Dead, Field of Ruin, the other field. And neither of those two categories of things are really in the format. And as a result of that, this deck has kind of a free roll in terms of setting up its mana in a way that it hasn't in the past.
Yeah, also when Zendikar Rising came out, there was a period when Cleansing Wildfire was a very common sideboard card that you would see, mainly aimed at the big mana decks, stuff like Tron and Amulet and so on. But then also, it would just happen to be very good against these decks that, I guess, technically do not have any actual lands in them as well. And all of that incidental stuff, as you say, has mostly vanished from the format. And these are the kind of decks where you need something to keep up with them most of the time. And if you're not going to have the incidental hate, and they're not popular enough that you're not going to have any explicit targeted hate, then they just get to run rampant and do their thing.
Yeah, it is a good time to be playing actual Rest in Peace, is all I'll say. I think the one other thing that I want to point out is that some of this interaction could have lined up earlier in the Modern Horizons era, but we're also moving into an era of Drown in the Loch over Counterspell in Grixis over Murktide, and that changes a lot in this matchup. Force and Negation being kind of the stopgap for a lot of the control decks, also an issue. So there are a lot of very specific lineups. Also, just the Jack-o'-lantern kill really makes it so that you aren't another deck that just loses to turn 1 Urza Saga, where they just okay, I have my Nihil Spellbomb turn 3, good luck, it's over. So maybe the other thing to look at is, even if you're a Lurrus deck with Urza Saga, access to a Grafdigger's Cage may drastically change your matchup here.
That makes sense. And this is actually a point in the favor of the Elvish Reclaimer builds of the John Saga deck, which were the flavor of the month about a month ago at this point, maybe a little less. Haven't seen too much talk since then, but I think that approach makes a lot of sense as a way to hedge against these decks and a lot of the other stuff, where you have this almost twin-esque combination of turn 1 Elvish Reclaimer, turn 2 reclaim a land away for Ghost Quarter, and then if you have a Red and 6 to follow up with, you are just strip mining them every turn for the rest of the game. And Belcher can, in theory, if they have a very specific hand, power through that with several rituals into Ironcrag Feet, stuff like that. But this is just a log which is pretty easy to assemble, and you can do it early on, and it doesn't require contorting your deck that much. These are all cards which you are actively excited to play anyway, for the most part.
Yeah. The only things I'll note is that I remember there were some maniac builds of Oops that just had a swamp in the sideboard or mountain. I can't remember. There was a point in time where there was a basic land in the sideboard of a lot of these decks just to beat Ghost Quarter that way. And while Jund hasn't shown up, there actually has been a decent amount of Golgari floating through the leagues, just the 2-color version of the Reclaimer deck. I don't know if that really has indications for the future, but I do think Reclaimer has a place in Modern moving forward.
One thing that I do like about these decks is not that the decks themselves are especially charming or novel, but the responses to them really can be. So one thing in favor of the creativity decks is that they are a Prismari command deck, and that card does a lot of things. It does a lot of things against Hammer, which is why that card in that deck popped up in the first place. But one of the hidden modes on that card is just decking an Oops deck at instant speed, right? There was an inevitable betrayal. So this is the suspend bribery in the sideboard of one of the Teemo Crash Gate decks, where if you just cascade into that, you get the Balustrade Spy from their own deck and then get to mill them and go off that way. Or there might be some weird corner cases where getting either the Thassa's Oracle or the Salvage Titan means they just literally can't actually win the game anymore. Just weird stuff like that. And of course, as you mentioned, there's always the roulette wheel moment with Ragavan, where sometimes just hitting their spy or their informer lets you just KO them with their own card.
Yeah, I really like what happens with Undercity Informer there, because when you flip the Informer, it lets you sacrifice any creature. So if you have the mana available, you can even kill them through the Memory's Journey backup kill, where I'll reshuffle and you're I'll just do it again. You're done. Move on to the next game. So, that 8 out of 60 chance or whatever it effectively is just a really, really fun wheel to spin. And I think of all the decks you could play in Modern, this one deserves to have that happen to them the most.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's go over to the Sunday challenge where this is, I don't know quite what to make of this, but Canister, who is actually quarantining because he has COVID at the moment, and so was not streaming this result, which is sad because getting to win a challenge on stream with your meme-ish, but not really, actually this is just the stock list going forward now, build of your deck, like that is peak content, which is ever more difficult to unlock in this current landscape.
Yeah, I would that stream would give me some flashbacks to some stories of Frank Karsten with food poisoning getting 10th at Worlds or whatever that one year.
Sure.
I believe that he showed up to the match with a designated seat in a bucket, but that was a different era. I would not advise doing that in the future, but you are correct. It would have made great content.
Yeah, and so we have this Ragavan fueled build of 4-color winning the challenge, but winning the challenge by winning a mirror in the finals. Celestial getting second place here with a very similar deck. I don't know if it was literally just lifted, copied and pasted, right-click saved from Canister's Discord here, but the broad sweep here is very similar. Is this just the go-to now going forward, or do you think there are real trade-offs here, which maybe this made sense for this week, but it's not going to make sense next week?
I think that you can just look at the memory deluges in the main deck and just be like, oh, I'm trying to win a mirror match in a lot of games and also like dig for specific interaction. I think that showing up with memory deluge in your 4-color deck against like burn or hammer is just like crazy mode, and you're playing a very specific game by playing that card. So I think that this is the build for now. It's the 4-color deck, has a lot of room to wiggle with everything, and I am interested to see. Was Memory Deluge in the early list of the 4-color deck? That card cycling back around is an interesting part of this equation.
Yeah, so I think the way we get there is, if you're wondering how you find room in this deck, even with 80 cards for Ragavan and Memory Deluge and some of these other cards, there are 0 witnesses and 0 ephemerates in this list. That entire angle has been cut out of the deck. And once you decide to move away from that, well, you need another source of card advantage in the mid game. And Canister was very low on these clunkier planeswalkers like Jason Mind Sculptor, Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, thinking they just die so easily, not just to Unholy Heat, but just to creatures attacking them, or to Fury in the mirror, or any of this stuff. And Deluge is something which is mostly resistant to everything that's going on. Like, you can't really point removal spells at it. You can, I guess, Thor sees it, but that doesn't feel good because at some point they just get to flash that back and bury you in card advantage. And then in the mirrors, I guess in game 1 scenarios, there's not really like specific cards that you're digging for, but if you were to have like the one Emrakul the Promised End, for example, in the sideboard, if you expect a lot of the mirror, having a card like Deluge, which is very it accesses a lot of your deck, just having access to that over the course of a longer game means that you're going to find that one of or that two of quite consistently, even with the higher card count.
Yeah, I actually hadn't noticed dropping Ephemerate because my brain just registers it being there. This is interesting in the context of our discussion with Levi recently, Leviathan 102, regarding Ephemerate or not Ephemerate in the deck. So yeah, that does make sense as kind of the stopgap for like, what is your big end game? It's like, well, I don't really want Ephemerate, so we're just going to deluge away and see where we go.
Mm-hmm. So that is the headline story here. Looking a little bit beneath that, we have a familiar face at this point, Bob49 on Belcher. And this rematch between Canister and Bob is one that we'll get to see again in the Marks, potentially. Both of them qualified. Bob with this modern deck, and would have to imagine that's going to be at the top of their list for what to play there. So maybe we'll get to see this match actually on camera this time.
Well, I think that's like also a minor miracle that Canister pulled that off. Like, that matchup is heinous.
Yes.
I there's nothing in this list that even makes it seem like it would be better. Like, things had to go horribly wrong. But sometimes that does happen.
I believe Canister said it took drawing Ragavan and all 4 copies of Counterspell to just about clinch out one of the games, and then managing to steal the other one as well.
Yeah, he did tweet about it on the spot immediately. His exact quote was, "Prouder of that than the Mythic Championship trophy, LOL." Which he may be, you know him. He may be being so sarcastic that he's being earnest with that statement.
Yes, Canister has a perfectly balanced sarcasm range. Really hard to poke a hole in his game there. Looking a little bit beneath that, in fourth place, we have another copy of Amulet Titan, in this case, leaning hard on Come the Great Creator. And that makes a lot of sense if you think that the direction the format is taking is a bunch of these wacky linear decks rising up to attack Shadow and 4-color, where this is a card which does actually give you a pretty decent plan against Belcher. Shutting off the namesake card, and also being a colorless threat that lets you claw your way out from underneath Blood Moon and so on. Likewise, against Oops, you're taking down the artifact acceleration that they rely on to race you, as well as the Charbelcher backup plan, and you can also just fetch Tormod Script or whatever to shut off Spy and Informer themselves. So it gives you a lot of versatility there. And then if you think the rest of the deck has a lot going for it, then that general approach makes a lot of sense. 2 copies of Burn in this top 8 as well, including in the hands of Talisker, who we mentioned as winning a challenge with a very wacky build of this Jeskai Stoneblade deck a while back, and you often see them popping up with these crazy experiments. So the fact that they're going back to just boring old Burn, of all things, maybe is a sign of something.
Yeah, this was something that was really interesting to me. It was the success of Burn this week. I don't know what to think about it. I mean, the deck is... I feel like it's one of those things where, like, you need to... I don't know. Whenever I've played Burn at an event and felt happy about it, it's been because I've been in the trenches and either burned people or gotten burned and just, like, had the stroke of genius that, like, this 6-day span is a burn time. I don't know. Maybe this is a burn time. I guess, we're Shadow, 4-color, fine matchups. People are dropping hate for it. Probably acceptable against the most of the linears. Eidolon being a generally good card against linear decks is probably one of the big positioning things it has this weekend. I will shout out to the heavy number of deflecting palms in both sideboards. That card is another card that is really good against linears. And I guess shout out to Lurrus for showing up both times and maybe doing something.
More on that specific card in a little bit, perhaps. Rounding out this top 8, we have Violent Outburst, making yet another top 8 here with Dredge. A perfect response if you think Burn in particular is picking up, and Dredge may benefit more than almost any other deck from Hammer falling away and 4-color and Shadow remaining near the top, especially if those decks have not adapted to decks like Oops by adopting more graveyard hate yet.
Yeah, I think the Dredge deck is... I mean, we talked about the ways to kind of work around the fact that Oops is a graveyard deck, but, like, you can have other interaction. With Dredge, like, it just is that, like, your plan is the stuff in their graveyard, maybe fight them on the stack, but it's not even that great of a way to do it, or just, like, hope they mulligan to 3. And even then they can beat you with a 3. Like, this list of Dredge I have advertised as being as close to Bazaar of Baghdad Dredge as we're going to get in Modern. And it feels like people just need to have it or go home when they play against this.
Yeah, I think the risk with Dredge is getting into these shootouts against the other linear decks, but Violent Outburst came prepared there, where you have your choice of ley lines, whichever of Leyline of the Void and Leyline of Sanctity is the game breaker in the matchup. 4 Thoughtseeds, and then the 3 Gemstone Caverns is really interesting, where on the draw, you can power yourself up to the point where you can actually just race these linear decks with a decent amount of consistency.
Yeah, that remains my favorite part of this list, is that in most matchups, your sideboarding is Gemstone Caverns in. I don't know. That's it. That's the end of the line.
Yeah, I think you're maybe cutting a different land before Gemstone Mine, but I love the idea of that just being the straight swap there.
Yeah, usually my experience was that you would, like, actually add a land on the draw for the caverns, just, like, going through, because it was just like, oh, this is a card I would like to draw, and, like, maybe I don't need the 3rd Silver Smoke Pool or whatever, but it is exceptionally fun to just, like, cast a turn 1 Cathartic Reunion. Pretty big fan of that as well.
Yes. Quick hits here just to round this out. We have another copy of that Is It Creativity deck in the hands of the Tunneling Cat, just missing this top 8 in 9th. And then in 16th place, we have Laplacian on Hammer, which that player being on that deck is no surprise, but this being the highest finishing Hammer deck across either tournament certainly is.
Yeah, it's I mean, this is their fairly stock playing Thoughtseize and Portable Hole, like a little more interactive list. Bitter Blossom and Dark Confidant in the sideboard may be a sign of the times of just like people are trying too hard to beat you and you got to do something else to win games.
Yeah, it kind of is just the Hammer diehard, so we're still seeing success at this point. You don't really see anyone just picking the deck up and winning because it's free money anymore.
I think that there is still good value. Like, if you were like, what is my highest value play for Modern in the long term? Like, where could I just sit down and grind a million hours? The answer would still be playing Hammer. But I started down that road and it's a painful road. A lot of your losses are just like very crushing and demoralizing. And like the margin between participating in the game and not is very slim. It feels really bad to lose with the deck. And the mistakes are super micro based. And there's a lot of things that you do at all times. And even when you do them right, it doesn't necessarily. It's not like with Amulet where like, oh, I messed up the micro, but like it's this big Hammer event that happened. It's just like, no, I messed up the micro and never gained traction on like any of these small exchanges. It's just like playing Zerg. You know, I don't know if you know anything about StarCraft, but Hammer is just the freaking Zerg of Modern. Especially like StarCraft 2 where you have to like keep clicking every 30 seconds or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, it's you get into those spots where you're 5 hours deep and you draw a Mem Knight for the 10th time when literally any other card would have been so much better, and you wonder how your life got into this position. That being said, I think we could easily see Modern circle back to the point where Hammer just is the default best deck again, and you can't be just a fair weather friend to the Hammer deck. I think if you get the reps in and you stick with it, when those good times come back around again, you know, you'll be able to hit the ground running and capitalize on that.
Yep, hardest deck in the format, most rewarding deck in the format.
All right, we spent a lot of time on these results there. Anything else before we move on?
Love to see Maximize Velocity showing up in the 29th place Izzet deck, just to kill people with Murktide Regent. Really big fan of that.
Yeah, really love that interaction with Crackling Drake in Standard and Pioneer, Historic, and Crackling Drake itself maybe has not aged so well, but Murktide Regent, bigger and better, and the ability to just, it's not quite the one shot most of the time, but just 9 or 10 damage out of nowhere. Like that's enough to get the job done pretty often. Yep,
just clean cut, one shot ish, kill them with that. And also when you jumpstart it, it pumps your Murktide.
All right, so on that note, we'll take a short break and then we'll be back with our main topic of the week here.
This week's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, your first stop for Magic the Gathering inspired stylings. Visit coalesceapparel.shop to pick up a t-shirt inspired by fan favorite Magic personalities, a hoodie from your favorite guild in the Ravnica University line, or just signal your intent to snap Keep in the Dark with an anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club sticker. Want to splash up a commander deck? Check out the Keeping It 100 sticker line and see if your favorite commander shows up there. Whatever you order, use code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your purchase at coalesceapparel.shop. Coalesce Apparel. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Okay, let's get into our main topic here, which we didn't really give an official name or a title to. It's more just general musings about where the format is now that the format hasn't changed in the way that maybe, at least I expected it to today.
Yeah, I had sort of preliminarily said that this was titled like the worst cards in Modern. I think that in light of no bans, it is worth discussing cards that people may have wanted banned, why that might not have happened, why that maybe should happen, where the pain points kind of are, just like musing about the presence of cards in Modern. And even if the format is in a really good spot, just talking about if any cards are actively making the format worse.
Mm-hmm. So do we start with the elephant in the room, or do we just nudge the elephant out of the way and try to not think of the elephant for the time being?
It's not an elephant, Dom. It is a monkey. And Ragavan, I think, is one of the cards that creates, I would say it creates the second most heat in terms of ban discussion of any card in the format right now. And I think that there's a lot of problems associated with it. I think that the games that you lose to an uncontested Ragavan are rather painful to lose, especially like in the extremes. This was another discussion prompted by this that I had outside of the podcast, was like, it is very painful to lose to the cards that start casting cards off of your own deck. When like Ragavan goes off and does it, it's maybe the most mild of the bunch because there's such a small window and an actual cost associated with it compared to something like Fallen Shinobi or Thief of Sanity, which are just their own thing. But there's still some of that experience, unless it's Undercity Informer, in which case no one has any, any shred of sympathy for you.
Yeah, I think that's the argument that gets made in favor of that dynamic, is that it mostly punishes the people who deserve to get punished. So I think you see some great examples of this in like Legacy or Vintage, where in Canister's showcase winning run with Reanimator, there were several points where an opposing Ragavan just hit a Reanimate from his deck and took his Grizzlebrand or took his Archon of Cruelty. Or, in Vintage, you really get to high roll people with their own Ancestral Recalls and Demonic Tutors and stuff like that. And I think that can be part of a fun experience, but it is true that it does feel weirdly violating in a way that's kind of hard to articulate, and it's not clear where the line is between stuff like Ragavan and a card like Gonti, which I've never heard a single complaint about. It seems to be a home run from both sides of the table there. And then you have stuff like Robber of the Rich, which, again, of all of the Eldraine cards, that one mostly passed without incident. So there's a lot of stuff in that space, and they really are leaning hard into it with a lot of the recent designs. But it's hard for me to distinguish between the ones that feel good, or at least don't feel bad to play against, and the one where I'm just, mashing my face into my keyboard afterwards.
I think that you can compare Ragavan in Modern and Legacy and see why it's banned in that format, and think about why it might not be banned in Modern to kind of get a little more to the core of that. Because I also don't have like a single cohesive thought way to describe the difference between those. But I think that the Legacy interaction, where most of the matchups with Ragavan, it just like hits and draws a good spell, like a Ponder or a Brainstorm a lot of the time. That is a lot of kind of the real pressure of like, oh, I got hit by Ragavan, the game is immediately over. Whereas in Modern, it's a lot more about the treasure, and then very incidentally, do you end up getting, KO'd by your own Thoughtseize. And even then, like, that is specifically reserved for matchups where that lower kind of like Unholy Heat style interaction is expected and almost required in general through the matchup. So you're signing up for getting punished in a specific case where like you are also a Ragavan player. Like, it's hard to Ragavan people and then be upset when you get Ragavan. Whereas in Legacy, it's a lot more like, oh, I just wanted to play with the cards you're supposed to play with. And this card is just the best thing to do and the best thing to do against the normal cards.
Yeah, in a Modern context, I think I would distinguish between two types of Ragavan deck. So there's a type where you would bundle Isn't Murktide in here and Grixis Shadow and all the decks in that space, where it's Ragavan, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Unholy Heat. You have this 12-pack that immediately starts off your deck list, decreasing the room for really much customization elsewhere. And those cards all complement each other so perfectly, and together they exert this really strong pressure on the curve of your deck, and thereby the curves of the other decks in the format that have to compete with it. And I think they are a lot more than the sum of their parts there, in a way that would make me look quite critically at any one of those cards, versus the other Ragavan decks, where I think Ragavan does a lot to just enable a bunch of weird fringe stuff in quite a fun way. So like the red-green Ponza style decks, where Ragavan is your new riff on Utopia Sprawl or Arbor Elf or something like that, or like the Aspiring Spike Boris deck, the Fervent Champion, Stoneforge Mystic, Swords of X and Y deck, where, yeah, Ragavan's just another really good one-drop in that deck, and sometimes you curve turn 2 turn 1 Ragavan into turn 2 Sword of Fire and Ice, and that's maybe tough to be on the receiving end of, but it's kind of cool because it doesn't happen too often. And I think that's the thing there, where for as much as Ragavan is this very universally strong card, and we're seeing it show up in even the generic, soupy, 4-color money pile now, in its more fringe applications, I do think it has a certain charm to it, whereas the other members of that unholy trinity of Unholy Heat and Dragon's Face Channeler, feel a lot more homogenizing to me. And so even though Ragavan is maybe the most obvious offender, I think it would be third on that list for me of the cards which you would open the format up more by removing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that there's I've talked about this before in the context of the War of the Spark Planeswalkers, how I'm a Teferi Narset apologist in these older formats. I think that Ragavan has a similar but more compressed version of that, where you have to interact with Ragavan, which means you are removing creatures or playing creatures, and incentivizing people to do that early is a good thing and generally leads to other decks that you would like to play against existing in the format, as opposed to decks that you would not like to play against. Like, we talked about Ragavan as a way to steal games against Belcher. Like, that is a totally fine role for the 1-drop here. As long as it's in the right window of not being full on oppressive the way Deathrite Shaman was. It just is this will maybe help me keep up, as opposed to my opponent's deck doesn't do anything. And then there's also this very subtle, expensive card issue where I think that it gets discussed a little more in the context of Historic right now, but the aversion to this is a real thing. This isn't just we're afraid of losing players by banning the expensive cards. No, printing new expensive cards and getting people to buy them and then banning them within 6 months is not a good look. And I think that there's a general desire to, I don't think you would want to touch Ragavan if you wanted to attack the Ragavan decks, unless Ragavan became so ubiquitous that it was not only dominating the metagame in percentage, but dominating the games that it was involved in and not counterable. One of the true scourges of a format, the way Uro or Oko may have been. I think that especially when you're printing new high profile cards like this, there is a very real cost there. And I think that if there was a ban levied at a red 1-drop in Modern, I would put my money on Dragon Rage Channeler, actually.
Do we have an update on that Marmoset index, by the way?
It briefly went down and went back up. You can actually see the little dip. Yeah, we had this discussion about whether we were trying to catch a falling knife or not. And in the time of that discussion, the price went down from 100 ticks to 80 ticks back up to 100 ticks. And so it was just a little bit of a bounce.
Yeah, I think Channeler would be the smart ban in terms of protecting people's investment and not make them gun shy about whatever the flagship card is from Modern Horizons 3 or Lord of the Rings or whatever the next blockbuster set is. And would more directly target those kind of homogenous decks of, the Izzy-Murktide and the Grixis Shadows of the world versus the spots where Ragavan shows up and actually does do something novel, and where having that be this ubiquitous card means it's a little easier to justify picking up that set of Ragavans because I can use them in the go-to build of the good decks. But then also, if I'm doing something weird on the fringes, Ragavan can help support that in the same way.
Well, it sounds like we're describing a lot of play patterns where Ragavan is supporting 3 or 4 mana cards. Have we considered saying the problem might be Lurrus of the Dream Den?
I have considered that and have in fact been saying it for quite a while now. So I am a broken record on that front. Do you have anything more to add there to what we said previously?
I would really enjoy if companions were unprinted. I am somewhat thinking through the second order implications on Lurrus more. I am actually sympathetic to Lurrus being the lesser of two evils. I think that playing against basically losing to Murktide Regent or Liliana or even Seasoned Pyromancer, I think is often a more painful experience than losing to Lurrus. I think that the Lurrus players are actually attempting to do something more, especially the dress down Lurrus thing is really awesome to me. Even if it's a horrible lock, it's something cool that they've done. It's more paced. It's less oh, I got Liliana on turn 2 and I can't control a creature and the game is over. That all said, I think it's just it's just the power level. It's just so there. Lurrus is just happening all the time to everybody. I think there is a point where And Lurrus, I think, does like have the right play patterns to kind of make up for how ubiquitous it is with like, just being like this lovable little cat doing some stuff in a game. We'll get to some of the other companions in a bit. Like I said, it's probably better if they don't exist, but if things aren't especially horribly broken, I don't know, they kind of are. I'm really trying to defend it, and it's just like the numbers are bad. It's just like I think Aaron Forsyth specifically said they were in the plan of if it's not broke, don't fix it. But like it's just like the weirdest, most subtle kind of broken that like tends to get ignored.
Yeah, I think it is a good sign for Modern right now compared to some of the other formats that got changed today, and then also previous snapshots of Modern, that there isn't any one thing where you can point at it and say, this needs to be changed right now or people will lose interest in your format. People are playing Modern right now. They do seem to be enjoying Modern right now. I see a lot of claims that this current Modern is the best the format's ever been, or maybe the best format ever. And both of those seem pretty hyperbolic to me. And I don't know, it feels like there's this tendency to really over-exaggerate these things. I don't think this needs to be the best format of all time to be a perfectly good and healthy format. But regardless of where it falls in that spectrum, I don't think anything desperately needs to change. I just think this is both an easy change to make in terms of all of those same decks still survive, so you're not ruining anyone's investment or shaking things up too much, but then also just the experience of playing the format gets a lot better. And I go back and forth here, and I'm curious to see what you think of, is it a cleaner fix to just nuke companions from orbit altogether, or to make a more targeted hit at Lurrus and maybe Yorion if you want to go through the second order stuff there, where for the most part, the people showing up with Kahira and Dragantha aren't doing anything wrong. At the same time, it's going to look very weird if in 5 years' time, people are still revealing only Kahira and Dragantha as this weird, like, reminder of some time that we prefer not to talk about.
I actually find Kahira, like, honestly more offensive than Lurrus, just in terms of what it does. Like, I think that Lurrus subsidizes the things the decks are already going to do, and there's, like, almost a real chance that the Lurrus decks would play almost nothing in that cost range to begin with. Whereas Kahira, it's just like, your control decks are better if they have a creature, but I guess that's not what's happening because we just draw an extra card sometimes. And Yorion, I think Yorion is just the most offensive in general terms, just of like, oh yeah, I just get a free Cruel Ultimatum in my hand every game where I just pay 8 mana and win. It happens to be an acceptable rate for Modern. So I just want to make the quick discussion. Like, Lurrus is definitely the card that's the most offensive here and not Mishra's Bauble. I think the answer is yes. I'm like interested in keeping Bauble around as like a bit of the old Modern build around style stuff. It hasn't been. It's a card that like clearly could be banned. It could have been banned at any point in time, honestly. But like, it's not really causing anything horrible to happen.
Yeah, I think Bauble is just kind of a nonsense card in general, where you have the weird awkwardness, especially in paper with the delayed triggers and so on, and it's just kind of this fiddly card that doesn't do anything. And when you're putting it in your deck, it's not because you really have any interest in Bauble itself, it's because this is a card type when I'm canning to 4 for Delirium, or for my Tarmogoyf, or what have you, or this enables Metalcraft for, I guess not Mox Opal anymore, but stuff in that vein. And it's just a interchangeable widget, and it literally is. Like, that's what the card does. It exchanges itself for another card, more so than a card with text you care about. That being said, of the two, I think the offender clearly is Lurrus, and the way you know that is because the most successful Lurrus deck for the past 6 months does not play Mishra's Bauble in the stock list, right? Like, if Hammer comes back, if Hammer makes this big resurgence, and 99% of the Hammer pilots are still playing Lurrus, as they probably should, and they don't have Mishra's Bauble in their deck, then banning Mishra's Bauble starts to look like a very short-sighted decision there.
Yeah, I am sympathetic to Mishra's Bauble, like I said, so no arguments there. So we've talked about Companion. I think we're both of the opinion that like it'd be better if we scrub that from the format. What about some other fair cards?
I guess just a closing thought on Companion is, and I think this is a crucial point to remember because it's easy to talk past each other when you're having this discussion with someone. For me, it's not that any given Lurrus deck, for example, is like heinously offensive, or if you removed Lurrus from that deck, things would be much different. I mean, that's almost part of why I want to remove it, is that it doesn't change too much in terms of the way the games play out. It's that, are we really going to be doing this for the rest of time, right? Because by definition, companions are repetitive in what they do, and they show up more broadly in the format and in games than any other card in decks in the entire format. And so this is going to be a defining feature of Modern for as long as it's legal. We've had 2 years of it. It's already got pretty old. Are we going to sign up for another 2 years or another 5 years in 10 years' time when Modern Horizons 5 is around the corner and original Lurrus is maybe still the best creature ever printed? Are we still going to be revealing Lurrus at the start of the game and then paying for it at some point to put it in our hands? I don't know. For me, it's got old already, and it's never going to get newer. It's just going to keep doing the same things, and we have really mined the depths of what Lurrus can do in an innovative way at this point.
Yeah, I just feel like it's so auxiliary to like anything actually occurring in the format that you don't want to make its own announcement to do it. You just kind of like, the next time you're in there, you take care of it. You know, it's just the like, I don't know, what's the like old broken suitcase in the corner that you're like, oh yeah, the next time I like take a bunch of stuff out to the garbage, that'll get thrown away, and then like that happens in like 8 months. That's about where I feel the companions sit.
Well, what are some of the less discussed cards that are worth flagging up here, do you think?
Well, I wanted to note Teferi Time Raveler as a card that was recently somethinged in Historic, has caused a lot of pain throughout the years, and is still showing up a lot in Modern. I think it's a good guy in the context of Counterspell and Cascade, but I could be convinced in the future that it's causing problems in terms of constraining things people want to do.
I think it's only a good guy in the context of Cascade, because Cascade is such a villain in one sense that, you know, anyone standing against it looks like the hero by default. I think that when you broaden the scope from just the decks where you cascade on 3 into the same spell every game, and you look at stuff like Bloodbraid Elf, right? Like an iconic Modern card that people are really excited to play with, just embarrassing kind of in the face of Teferi, or all the stuff that Teferi hits by accident. Like, it is still baffling to me that Teferi and Finale of Promise were in the same set, for example, where one of them just never gets off the ground, never sees the light of day, despite being a very powerful card, just because why would you when it's hosed by a card in the same set? And just all the stuff in that space where it kind of needs the help in Modern, honestly. Like, I don't think there's anything which only Teferi is keeping down, but Teferi doesn't help matters there. And if it had been the rebalanced version from the start, maybe still at 3 mana, maybe Modern could bear that still, but if it is the shields are up on your own turn versus we're just hosing a bunch of stuff by accident, I think it would have been received a lot better.
Yeah, this is a discussion that's been done throughout the years. I don't think anything's happening with it. I just kind of wanted to identify it as like a potential pain point in the format for players playing, even if right now, like you said, it is not the card that is keeping a lot of things out of the format. Fury and Solitude, on the other hand,
yeah,
those are cards that are keeping things out of the format.
Yeah, and those also do fall in the bucket of these expensive recent mythics from a Modern Horizon set. I don't know if that gives them plot armor in terms of future balance developments, or if that's time limited in some way.
Yeah, I think that Solitude is generally a card that you are, if you are getting solituded and it's like a huge issue, you're probably up to no good, in the sense that like you're infect, and on the flip side of that, like you might be able with a normal creature deck to just power through the card disadvantage pretty easily. I think Fury is the painful one, like the real painful one. My question with Fury is, there's a lot of cards like Plague Engineer was the card that we criticized in this same operating space before. I don't know if just Fury is the reason a lot of these decks aren't playable. And I don't know. It's the kind of thing too where like I think there's a weird scenario where you're like, well, elves or whatever could be good, and it's nice to have a stopgap. But like, what does that stopgap look like if it doesn't look like Fury?
Maybe it looks like, I guess, the combined forces of Lava Dart and Plague Engineer and Ren and Six and, I guess, Yawgmoth in a second order way and so on and so forth. And this was when we ranked the incarnations as the set was being previewed. We flagged this up as why we had Fury near the bottom of our list, because all the decks that it's good against can't really exist in what at that time was a world dominated by Lava Dart. And then the red decks that existed at the time didn't have a clear use or spot for Fury. And so it's not that the card didn't have a powerful effect, it clearly did. It just wasn't clear what that effect was doing. And I think that those lingering pressures from the first Modern Horizons not just illustrate one of our criticisms of that set when we look back at that in preparation for MH2, which was that any one of those cards individually maybe would be tolerable, but there's a lot of overlap in what they box out of the format together. And I think a lot of that has stuck around, where I don't know when was the last time I saw a Plague Engineer being cast in Modern, for example, between those decks not existing in part because of Engineer and Fury, and then Lurrus boxing out Engineer and so on. Haven't seen that card in a while. Have seen a lot of Ren and Sixes though, and if I wasn't seeing a lot of Ren and Sixes, I might be seeing a lot of Lava Darts and Furies. And so you really need all the stars to align perfectly for none of those cards to be suppressing your your champion of the parish deck or whatever.
Yeah, it's tough. And my experience with humans has just been that, like, you do all this stuff and then your opponent activates Urza Saga once and you're like, oh, it's that easy these days, huh?
I'm not.
We might get to that one later, but
yeah, I'm not saying that this is the only thing keeping those decks down, but I almost wonder if we are underrating how obnoxious Fury would have the potential to be, where if you just drop Fury into like 2018 Modern, for example, where you have a lot of creature decks running around and they just vanish overnight because this new thing just devoured them, then it would be easy to see that relationship directly. Instead, it's, well, Fury is more of the nail in the coffin than the coffin itself.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's one last fair card I had called out, and that is Expressive Iteration, which is one of those like really subtly overpowering fair cards, just like really, really, really good. And we see it winning in basically every format. I've heard calls for its discussion in Standard because it's the card powering a lot of the Is It nonsense. Do you think it is borderline like approaching too good for Modern, or are we? I don't know about too good, but like it is. It's easy to point fingers at the cards that like obviously crush you in a game, but like I think there's a lot of games where like if you aren't paying attention to what happened, like you realize the game just got lost on turn 4 when your Murktide opponent cast Iteration because you got too busy trying to interact with their stuff, and it's just like, oh, I'm down an iteration and then the next one and then it's over. I don't know if you have any thoughts beyond that on this card.
Yeah, this really came into sharp relief during the Is It Paris takeover, where sometimes things would be going right. You would you would bolt their first Swift Spear, and then you would lightning bolt the follow-up Soul Skull Mage, and you would think, okay, phew, I've dealt with the first wave. I've got a little bit of breathing room now. And then they would cast Iteration, and suddenly they would have more cards in hand than you somehow, and be attacking you with something big. And it just felt like, okay, well, I need to answer everything they play, but if I'm trading 1 for 1, which is kind of what I have to do, then I'm just going to get buried under Iteration. And the fact that their, all action 19 land deck is just drawing more spells than I am. And it felt really difficult to outmatch them on any kind of conventional axis. And then, of course, the new streamlined builds of, Grixis Shadow and Is It Murktide really take that to the extreme. And I think the most offensive thing about Iteration to me is how it encourages these other pressures on the format to be very, very fast, very efficient, all based around these cheap cards where if you go back a few years and you put Iteration into that snapshot of Modern, and maybe this is not a good metric to keep coming back to, but I think it would struggle to make much of an impact. Maybe in, if we're going back to the time when Phoenix existed, then it would be a big deal there. But for the most part, I I think it is at its best in a format where you have a lot of good, cheap, proactive cards. And that's a format which Modern just traditionally has been and is right now. And when you put it alongside Ragavan, Channeler, Unholy Heat, all in the same set, and stuff like that, it just feels like more of the same in a way that's quite overpowering.
Yeah. The one good thing I will say about it is it feels like a way to make the non-Lurrus decks both have like a reason to exist and a way to compete with Lurrus and the pseudo mirrors. There is a weird tension between this and Lurrus where, like, if Lurrus didn't exist, I think I would struggle to build a fair deck that didn't include this card. If this card didn't exist, I'd have the same like situation with Lurrus on the flip side. And then also, like, Lurrus is subsidizing the entire color black so hard in Modern that it almost feels like their combined pressures extends the possibilities of what you can do with fair decks in the format. But I don't know how much of that is just like you're like, huffing the glue of the Lurrus mirrors and like just like this is how you live your life and this is how it'll always be. And I don't know. I think that it is the dynamics that they promote against each other are healthy in the context of that. I just don't know if it's too warped inside its own vortex.
I do wonder, in a different world, if, let's say, Mox Opal existed, but Urza Saga didn't, how much overlap there would be between Iteration and Opal. Because those two cards do pair together very nicely, but the shells that Opal really helped to enable before don't really exist at present, and so we never get to live out that hypothetical.
It depends. I think you would sacrifice, like, does Iteration plus, I guess Iteration plus Urza does pair pretty well. So yeah, no, you're right.
Yeah, or just, I guess Mistress Bauble is another piece of this puzzle too, where it is a lot easier to just fire off an iteration and not plummet to the floor of what that card can do, where if you hit a Bauble, okay, well that's going to be the spell I have to play this turn, and then I just get my pick of the litter with the rest. Whereas there are definitely times in Standard specifically where you iteration into like a 3-drop that you can't cast and another iteration and a land which you can play, but it makes your sequencing awkward, and you see where the edges of that card start to fray. Whereas if you're just firing all cylinders in one of the larger Eternal formats, it's like, well, this is just all I want to be doing every turn. It's just casting more iterations.
Yeah, I do kind of love that the floor of the card, and everyone is complaining, is like, how many times have you played Anticipate in a constructed format over the last 6 years? It's like enough. That's the
hey!
It's so wild.
I've cast strategic planning in the past 6 months. I'm not above that.
Weren't you like using the graveyard part of it a little bit?
Yeah, so that's kind of cheating, but
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk a bit more about cards that are bordering on cheating after this ad break when we get to some of the unfair stuff that might be causing some pain points in Modern.
If you want to buy Magic the Gathering cards, we have you covered, but if you want to sell them, that's never been easier too. With a 30% store credit bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry, there's no reason to sell anywhere else. Go to starcitygames.com/sell and pick one of 4 convenient ways to sell your cards to us. You can use our buy list, you can ship your cards to us, you can come to us in person in Roanoke, Virginia, and if you have an entire inventory that you want to offload, we can come to you. Go to starcitygames.com/sell for more information. Okay, let's talk about some of the unfair cards which are putting some constraints on the format potentially. And that distinction between fair and unfair is always a little bit of a murky one. So instead of trying to get deep in the weeds on the theory, let's just call out some cards. Let's fire some shots here. So what's at the top of the list?
Colossus Hammer. It's the best one. If you're going to ban any unfair card in the format, you have to really think about if you're actually attacking a deck that is more powerful than this deck. And I think that Colossus Hammer is by far the more unique effect. I think that there's a lot of room for this is free to equip or whatever. Like that kind of effect could show up in a future set. This is the whole survival Vengevine argument from a decade ago, where like you want to, if you're looking at which of 2 broken things to ban, you want to ban the one that is less likely to be replaced in the future. And the overlap of cheap to cast, giant equip that is expensive to equip is kind of a funny punchline once, but I don't think they're going to make, Gargantuan Hammer in a set in 7 years.
Yeah, I could see Sigada's Aid going instead as the fastest enabler that pushes you in this very linear direction, and giving the equipment flash makes it easier to bob and weave around interaction as well. Whereas you could imagine Colossus Hammer in a more conventional Pure Steel Paladin deck as like a Stoneforge Mystic Bullet, for example, or I guess Paladin itself maybe would deserve a look where, in theory, this is a strong incentive to build your deck in a certain way, but not one where you're just doing like the one thing over and over again. In practice, when Paladin has showed up in Modern, it's because you're casting it on turn 2 and then casting 27 Bone Swords and then stitching that into something else. But I could believe that there is a fair Pure Steel Paladin deck out there that has some cool and unique things going for it in a way that, you're never seeing Sigada's Aid put to good use, for example.
Well, why would you play Pure Steel Paladin when you can just play Fervent Champion? Get with the times.
Or both. I mean, they're both nice. You can pump your Pure Steel Paladin.
Yeah, we did not consider that they're both knights, and you can play your Kinsbale Cavalier with them. That was something that I had not put on the page right here.
See, yeah. This is now a deck that I want to build, but I can't justify because I could just be playing Hammer instead.
Well, you can put Hammer on your double striking creature from the Cavalier, and then it all works out.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think of all like the broken things that Hammer feels like it's in the sphere of affinity in terms of like the broken things you can do with something in the format where like it is very powerful. It is something that you require, I don't want to say specific interaction, but like it forces you to do a thing on its terms to not die. But it's like attacking with creatures and putting equipment on them is not the most offensive way to be combo killing someone.
Yeah, so there's another card here which appears in these equipment shells and heavily subsidizes them, and also is basically omnipresent elsewhere as well. So let's talk about Urza Saga, which multi-format all-star at this point, and nowhere more so really than in Modern.
I have come around to Urza Saga being a actively good feature of the format. My early impressions were not great. I think you could probably go back to some of the episodes in June and July where it's just like, why is our toolbox also making all this stuff? But I think over time, people have come to appreciate the fact that it is a very slow card. And it is very easy to punish with tempo plays. Like this is a lot of the interaction between Dress Down and the fact that Hammer is no longer among the winningest decks in the format, even if it's still one of the better decks. Merfolk Trickster has been effective, if that gives you an idea of the scope of the tempo here. And I think that the tutor for a 1-mana artifact part of the card has, aside from Amulet, which I'm not going to talk about that right now, has broadly been just like a way to punish the right people with a Pithy Needle or a Tormod Script.
Yeah, and then you get into these decisions of, do I just play my Saga on turn 1, knowing that it's going to disappear in a few turns and maybe hinder my development in the meantime, give out the chance to get the constructs out of it, because getting that Pithy Needle, getting that Soul-Guide Lantern or that linear hate card that quickly, that's my utmost priority. And it forces you, in your very first move of the game, potentially, to make this bold declaration about the way that this game might be going. And I think you have these interesting exchanges around Saga sometimes where you try to like strand the Saga by going after their other resources, or do you attack the Saga itself? Or from the Saga side is, I could play this out now and build towards something in a few turns, but what if they anticipate that and try to tax my mana, tax my resources on the turns where I want to be activating my Saga and making constructs? And I think there's a lot of interesting back and forth there. I do wonder if, so the obvious trade-off in terms of banlist discussion is, I don't know if you can have Mox Opal and Urza Saga in the same format. I think this may be a pick one kind of situation there. I don't know if there are any less obvious examples of things which you really can't allow them to coexist in the same format as Saga, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was actually the case.
Yeah, it does amplify any broken artifact stuff happening in a really absurd way. Like that, the Hammer interaction where you just have like, this is a very fast combo deck that also is just an Urza Saga deck is really, really something else. So if you have anything along those lines pop up, Saga is going to make it significantly worse than it already would, because you have to play a fair game and also like a non-linear game against them. And it just sometimes is asking too much. But I think as long as you realize the blame is on, I don't know, Krark Clan Ironworks in those cases, I think Saga is a fine card to have exist.
So with that in mind, I guess we can get onto another card which is tangentially linked, I suppose, with Urza Saga.
Yeah, so I had put Primeval Titan on this list. I made this argument recently about how Primeval Titan actually might be the card on the modern ban list, or not on the modern ban list, that is responsible or associated with the most cards that are on the ban list. It's pretty close with like Grape Shot and I'm trying to remember what the other, like Looting and Opal. Like it's also with those. It feels like it is in the same category of like Looting and Opal, where like whenever there's a problem being caused by like generating a creature with lands ahead of the curve, it's just like, this is the worst possible way that it goes, is your opponent Primeval Titans you. And it's like really deterministic. And I think that the only argument for like Titan is the kind of card where like every few years you're going to have to go in and fiddle with the format because of it. And I think that the argument is that maybe a mix of the cards that are banned because of Titan are better for the format in the long term than Titan is.
I could believe that. At the same time, it seems like it may be in that, I guess this is just the flip side of what you said, but it may be in that Looting or Opal role of this is the enabler of sorts that makes all of these other things possible and offers this unique direction that you can take in the format, where absent Primeval Titan, there really aren't that many incentives to just accumulate a bunch of resources and then really try and go over the top by casting, a 6-drop the hard way, as opposed to, I don't know, I'm casting Khan Liberated on turn 3 and that's a joke. That's the only thing my deck is able to do. And even though a 6-drop cannot really be an enabler in the same way that something like Looting or Opal can, it's maybe more of an incentive or a payoff where this is, you bridge to this, and then this is what unlocks whatever land-based endgame you're working towards. And as long as there's enough variety in that or enough ways to attack that, and we've seen some quite useful additions to the format there. So stuff like Alpine Moon, I think, was like a subtly important printing for Modern, and certainly now in the Urza Saga era, or stuff like that, where they're clearly willing to print this quite bespoke land destruction or cards that interact with lands, but not in a haha, I just pillaged you on turn 3 through turn 5 kind of way. I think it's manageable while offering this unique angle, which I guess was kind of what you did get in smaller formats for a while. Like for a solid period in 2019, 2020, that's what Standard and Pioneer and Historic were, right? It's just, I'm going to get to 4 or 5 mana, and then here's a card that doubles my mana and draws me 2 more cards, and then we'll just go from there. I get why bundling all of those together, people might get sick of Primeval Titan or be scared away from Modern because of it, but given everything else that's going on, I think it's I think the format can handle it.
Yeah, I think that there's also the flip side of this is that it is a 6-mana card, and if you are doing anything reasonable to get to the point of casting a 6-mana card in Modern, that should like inherently be fine in the format. The problem is that whenever there is something unreasonable happening, it just happens that Titan is the thing that it does that is the problem.
Yeah, I think comparing this to a few years ago where you had a lot more time to cast Primeval Titan, when you did, it was actually quite difficult for a lot of decks to kill. So even when Fatal Push really was a game changer in terms of how vulnerable the average creature was in the Modern format, Titan just dodged those conversations entirely. And now you have stuff like Unholy Heat, Dress Down doing this weird Essence Scatter impersonation. You have ways to deal with Titan itself or to neutralize it. And then you now have more ways of dealing with whatever lands Primeval Titan leaves behind on its way out. And so I think every aspect of that dynamic now is in a more healthy balance. And then also just set against this backdrop of all of the good cards cost 1 and 2 mana, I think having an aspirational 6-drop to work towards isn't the worst thing in the world.
You're an effective stump speechman for Primeval Titan, aren't you? You have a lot of experience
It's
speaking to this card's merits.
highly motivated reasoning, to be sure, but there it is.
Okay. What about some? Does this even feel like real Magic to be casting Balustrade Spy and Goblin Chart Belcher with no lands in your deck? I almost respect the one land Belcher decks in Legacy more because sometimes you hit the Taiga, and that was exciting. This really feels like nonsense, and I think that there are arguments in terms of like consistency and repeatable play experience with these decks that are, I don't know if they are the best things for the format long term. I mean, Balustrade Spy and Undercity Informer have ended up on a ban list already because of this.
Yeah, so compared to stuff like KCI or some of the weird and wacky combo decks that we've had in Modern over its lifespan, I don't think these are too out of bounds just aesthetically. The thing that really rankles me about these is the air quotes around if you have 0 lands in your deck, because I almost classify the DFCs and how they interact with these cards the same way that the Cascade into Valky, no, actually it's a Tibalt interaction. Like that felt like, not only is this egregiously powerful, but why are we allowed to do this in the first place? Like, even if this was toned down, the fact that this is a legal maneuver under the rules just seems like a bit of a head scratcher. And to me, the DFC's cheating land count in this way almost operates more in that space.
That, I think, is part of it as well. I think that if any part of this ends up getting banned, by the way, I think it is much more likely that it is Spy and Informer. I think that if something from the Belcher deck gets banned, I think it's more likely to point to Ironcrag Feat. Or I guess there's an argument for Recross the Paths just because of like, I don't know if anyone has actually done this in paper, and I don't want to think about what happens when they do.
Just resolving Recross the Paths?
Yes.
I've seen it before. It's not pretty, and does tend to take a while. And it is a uniquely bad feeling from the other side of you're sitting there with Recross the Paths resolving, knowing that 99% of the time you're going to be dead here, and it's going to take 5 minutes to figure that out, but you don't really want to scoop because what if they mess up the pile? Or what if they try to play around something that you don't have, and as a result, they open themselves up to something that you do have? And it's a waste of everyone's time. We don't need to be going through all of that. The card Goblin Charbelcher, offers some pretty obvious angles of attack through stuff like, Pithing Needle, Stony Silence, Leyline Sanctity, cards in that vein. That being said, if you bundle the graveyard decks together and the same cards which you might want on any given weekend for Dredge or Crabvine or Reanimator or God knows what, if they also give you a measure of insurance against oops, then maybe it's more tolerable to lose to that because that's a gamble which you're already preparing to make anyway.
Yeah, maybe the real solution is just to send a middle finger right at all the Adnos players and take out Thassa's Oracle so that the oops deck is less redundant in terms of its kills. And because those people, this list has been popping up with the 2 and a black, Exile 13 tutor, and I think at this point they just really gotta learn that they gotta stop doing this stuff and get around to playing actual decks. Maybe that's the real solution.
They need to be saved from themselves. Yeah, I guess the reason I get so hung up on the is this a land or is this not a land thing is I don't want to be at F&M trying to explain to someone why, well, technically I can play my Shadow Skull Smashing as whatever the other half is named off my Corsair Crucifix, even though the front side says spell. But when I'm resolving my Balustrade Spy, well, that works differently for some reason. And you just have to trust me on that. Don't ask any tough questions because I won't be able to tell you.
Yeah, I'm more thinking about the scenario where you're just flipping cards and then you forgot to flip one back last game and now they're just arguing. I don't want to be part of that argument where it's just like, no, that is the back half of Shatter Skull Smashing. It's like, no, that's not how it works. That's the messy one.
Well, one of our locals around here who owns a foil Jund deck, of course, which I've played before, has now acquired a foil Belcher deck. And so watching them, for every single land drop of the game, play a shiny land, which you have to squint at to make out what it is, remove it from one of its outer sleeves, and then get the corresponding like DFC from the DFC pile that's like stacked up across, and then turn that around and put that one into the inner sleeve. And that by itself is taking 20 seconds. And that's just the most basic game action that's taking place every single turn. It's a lot. It has frayed on my patience quite a few times.
Yeah, I have not thought through the physical logistics of playing a deck that is all DFCs, but the fact that you need to bring an extra deck box for the DFCs. Do they make, by the way, just asking for this player, do they make foil checklist cards, or is that a thing of the future?
I don't believe they do, and I don't know how that plays into any larger like marked cards discussion or anything, but because I guess technically these are all of your mana sources, right? Like you're not representing your foil Goblin Charbelters with DFCs or anything, so there is a pattern in that sense. I really do not want to think through this any further. Jesus.
Product idea for Wizards of the Coast as we move on to another ad break and eventually nonsense of the week, because this is where we've devolved into nonsense. Foil checklist cards. Okay, with that,
how about
carry onwards?
How about a modern dual deck that is just like a foil Belter deck or a foil Oops All Spells deck?
That is a product. Maybe they can print it with a specific context, like the Stoneforge Mystic deck, where you're allowed to play the deck as it exists for all time, even if the cards get banned, but like there's just like some random weird stuff going on with it. So maybe in like 15 years when all these cards are on the ban list, it's like, aha, but I have 2 Balustrade Spies and 3 Undercity Informers. That is the legal configuration.
And we can ponder that dream for a moment before coming out with our Nonsense of the Week.
What's up, gamers? Ryan Overturf here to remind you to check out the 540, Star City Games' own Cube podcast, where each week myself and Ryan Sachs discuss anything and everything Cube Draft. From the perspective of Cube designers and drafters alike, we're tackling topics like deep dives into specific archetypes, Cube reviews for new sets as they release, and offering general insights for anybody interested in Magic's greatest format. Whether you're a seasoned Cube drafter or you haven't dipped your toes into the wonderful world of Cube just yet, I think you'll find the listen worth your time. Check out the 540 right here on StarCityGames.com and wherever you find your podcast.
Okay, let's close this out here. And one of the arguments in favor of Urza Saga is it really goes in basically any deck that you want to put it in. I saw someone put it in a Neoform sideboard as like an alternate win condition the other day, which kind of blew my mind. You found a somehow even less conventional use for that card here.
Yeah, so this is a League 5.0 by user Depian. And on MTG Goldfish, it is simply described by you, as in the color blue. This is actually a bit of a classic that I believe floated around in 2014-ish with the release of M15 and the release of a specific card called Chief Engineer, which is your artifact spells have Convoke. This is a weird blue creature artifact deck based around Grand Architect that is also an Urza Saga deck, but seeing these Throne of the God Pharaohs yet again in this year just really made me smile. And that is the synergy specifically is Throne of the God Pharaoh is a 2-mana artifact from Amonkhet. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. But when your deck has Grand Architect to tap your creatures for mana, Chief Engineer to convoke with your creatures, and Smuggler's Copter just to like, someone gets in the copter and then they get out and the next person gets on in. You can actually just tap all these janky Mausoleum Wanderers and Fairy Seers and Silver Ravens in this deck to kind of get somewhere and kill your opponent with that card. Or just win with Urza Saga. Your choice.
That too. Grand Architect is one of those fan favorite cards which the moment you see it, your mind starts whirring and you think about all of the crazy things you can do with it. One of the limiting factors in Modern, though, has been just good, cheap blue creatures to pair with it. And Silver Raven was not what I had in mind. I didn't look at the MH2 spoiler and think, perfect, this is what Grand Architect needed, but maybe it is, at least in some context.
Yeah, it is interesting how there's actually not a ton of benefit for that card being an artifact creature in this deck. It just accidentally is a blue flyer that incidentally like pumps your Urza Sagas, and you can find off Glint Nest Crane. Kind of adorable.
Yeah, there have been lists, and this one has them in the sideboard that have stuff like Master of Ethereum, where you do care about having actual artifact creatures. We have a nice one of $80 a borrow Palace in the Clouds in the mana base here. No obvious application for that as far as I can tell, but I guess if you own one, then you may as well just shove that in.
Yeah, on the note of budget, I really enjoyed looking at the Magic Online prices for this deck. The total price is about 500 tickets. About 240 of that is in Force Negation, and another 230 is in Urza Saga, and the rest of the deck is basically free. I just really enjoy that distribution of costs.
Yeah, there's still like a little bit of price memory from Walking Ballista, but that's it really. Otherwise, it's just bargain basement rares and a bunch of random nonsense commons and uncommons. But yeah, this deck has a place in my heart, and it's nice to see it being dragged kicking and screaming into the modern day here.
It has so much charm. That's just really what I love about it. There's just a lot of charm here.
Even just stuff like my Mausoleum Wanderer now makes you pay 2 because my Grand Architect pumps it, or there's just so many like cute little things which, they're probably not good, but they're cool, and that's what matters here, especially for this segment.
Yeah, Nonsense of the Week is about your Lodestone Golem not making your Silver Ravens cost more mana, not about anything else.
Yes. So on that note, we will be wrapping things up for this week. Strange and confusing times. Hopefully we get to keep doing this in some capacity past the end point here in February. But regardless, we will be back until then, and hopefully after that with more Nonsense of the Week. So you can find me on Twitter at Dominaria. You can find Ari on Twitter at ARMLX. You can find our written content for the next month, at least, at StarCityGames.com. And hopefully we can all find you out there beyond that as well. Take care, everyone.